Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and today we're returning to our series of podcasts on the housing emergency, folks. We're calling it an emergency, not a crisis. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and the man who spent the last 2 weeks studying for his fake nurse exams, Martin McMahon.
Thanks very much,
Martin, I believe you are now a fake nurse as well as a fake lefty.
Absolute specialist nurse.
More importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by architect, UCD lecturer, and the woman who's been most mentioned on the podcast but had yet to appear on the podcast, Orla Hegarty.
Good morning.
Orla, thanks so much for coming on the pod.
Thank you.
The reason I did make that point is because we've gone back over the series of podcasts we did in terms of the housing emergency, and there was an underlying theme was that I think it was Mel Reynolds said to us, if you could just get Orla into the Department of Housing for a few hours, within a few hours we'd actually be on our way to tackling the crisis. So that's pretty high praise for the most handsome Southsider I've ever met.
And he did say so. He actually did, and he said 10 minutes with Orla, and we'll have all this sorted out.
I don't think anybody could solve this in 10 minutes.
It's about. I think what we're trying to really get to though is the fact that there are practical steps that can be done, and people keep there's an old saying that's coming up more and more now that's bothering me, and they keep saying, "Oh, this is a complex issue," and they keep saying it's a complex issue. It's a complex issue, as if that deflects from doing nothing. And when you're doing nothing, you're not going to improve anything. So there are things we can be doing. We need to be looking at what we were calling, myself and Martin downstairs were calling construction dysfunction, and that's something that you have a lot of expertise on in terms of what isn't working and why it isn't working.
I suppose it is a complex issue. Sometimes it's a complex issue because people say, I would do anything for housing, but I won't do that.
Yeah.
So, the issue is more maintaining some other position or maintaining some other policy or protecting some other interest. So you end up not doing something or not doing something properly. But fundamentally, the bottom line is if we want more homes, we have to make more homes. And everything else is secondary to that. And in order to make more homes, there's two things you can do. You can use buildings you have, and you can improve them and turn them into homes, or you can build new ones. So where I've been coming from on this is to look at those two things in the most basic way possible. How do you make that happen? Obviously, the quickest and cheapest is to use buildings we have. I think certainly a lot of the policy has been very slow to do that in a very proactive way on the ground. It's the quickest fix, and it's the best way to use a limited amount of labour because you can turn it around a lot more quickly and you don't have to build infrastructure.
And I'm right in saying, like, I saw a tweet yesterday from the Department of Housing saying, if you see a vacant home, let us know. And you're thinking, how many years into this crisis are we along the tracks, and they're actually tweeting saying, let us know? And you're thinking, why don't they know?
Well, there's a problem. I mean, the CSO identified in the census, which is now probably nearly 2 years ago, that there are 183,000 vacant homes. And the CSO are very rigorous. They knock on every door several times, so we can trust their numbers. Obviously, in the meantime, some of them are not vacant anymore, and things might have fallen into dereliction or any other reason. But we could trust what they had then, and even though people argue about whether that number is right or wrong, I don't think it really matters, because 5% of 180,000 is more than the number of new homes built last year. Yeah. So 5% of 180,000 could double the new homes last year, new stock, just by getting 5% back into use. Peter McVery Trust have done a lot of work on this. They had an empty homes conference last year. They looked at places in the UK where they have empty homes officers, people who go around door to door, and they don't just put out a policy statement. They go on the ground and they find it, and they find what's the barrier to somebody using the house. What's the reason for the vacancy? What could we do to support this coming back into use?
Well, I think it was Lorcan, or was it Mel yesterday? The government was using figures of 17,000 new builds for last year.
No, it was the Central Bank of Ireland put out a report and actually quoted 19,000.
Yeah, which is wildly overstated. The real output is about half of that from all the metrics that are valid and that you can.
But this is our major problem. They're not using the correct metrics to measure the problem. If you don't measure the problem, you can't find a solution to fit the problem.
Absolutely. If you don't actually know what's happening, you're at risk of using the wrong policy. But more than that, you're at risk of everybody else using the wrong policy. So the people who are training people for the construction industry, people who are importing materials, the banks when they're planning their mortgage lending for next year, all the other things that flow from that are going to be wrong.
If the central bank are saying 19,000 properties were built, and that's less than half of what was actually done, and they're then planning on mortgage lending criteria, that's all influenced by a false metric.
It is, yes.
Stunning.
But my impression from speaking, we'll say, to Lorcan and Rory, is that they know what the correct stats to use are. They can pull out the correct figures if they wish, but politically the correct figures look awful. So they're using these inflated figures to give a better impression. Now that seems to be what's happening. If they have the available data and they won't use it, and they'll take these whatever ESB connections or whatever it is and use those instead, that's that they don't want to solve the problem.
Well, there are two databases available to the government, neither of which are published in a form that people can read them easily, both of which are capturing every new house in real time by address and by whether it's an apartment or a house and what local authority it's in. So both of those databases are on a monthly basis capturing all of that, but neither of them are published in a form that people can read. So
it would take somebody, an intern, to sit there and decipher that into bills in an easy, recognisable way. 30 grand a year job. Well, the building energy rating one now is being published, but not by the public sector, by somebody in the private sector. And the BCMS one doesn't seem to be collated nationally. That's the Building Control Management System. Each local authority, and there are 31 of those, have different sets of numbers. So it's surprising that 2 years into a programme for housing that we don't have published statistics. Well, even 2 years, we are going on 8 years. At the moment, we're heading into 8 years with 10,000 homeless people. That's not even looking at the affordable market where people have just literally pulled out. They know they can't buy, will never be able to buy. We have people queuing in Ongar again, and it was just this awful moment where it's not the same as when we were building 135,000 properties a year. But my God, when people are queuing on a Monday for properties that go on sale on Friday without even knowing what price they're going to be, it's really hard, particularly having seen the cycle the last time. Yes. And particularly knowing that the people who took mortgages 10, 12 years ago, a lot of them suffered a lot of pain because of the mortgage they took. And a lot of them suffered a lot of pain because they bought off the plans and they bought poor quality. And still 10, 12 years later, those people are dealing with the fallout of quality problems, whether it's fire safety or pirate. And none of those issues have been addressed. And it's really worrying now to see other people queuing up to take out big mortgages with the history we've had. And more, I suppose that brings us to another point that we do want to talk about. We have on the flip side a construction industry that 12 months ago said, we're ready to go. We've got the staff. We've got the people. We're give us the green light. Give us a VAT cut and give us a few incentives, and we'll start building. Now they're saying, "Woe back the horses. We don't have the bodies. We don't have the thing." And sure, it's not even viable anymore because it's too expensive to build. I can't build a 3-bedroom house for less than 363,000 or whatever the approximate figure is. No one's calling out the actual. That doesn't tally what was said 12 months ago. 6 months ago, actually, in the case of the Construction Industry Federation. The Construction Industry Federation came out and said, we have ample people. There is no shortage of workers. I follow this really closely. Within 6 months, there's a shortage. And now there's a chronic shortage. Now, I told them 12 months ago, you don't have enough people. And they're all getting the hell out of the country because the conditions here are so bad. Well, we've a huge problem with labour, and I agree with you. Up until relatively recently, construction industry representatives were saying, "You get this, tweak the dial a little bit, grease more, the wheels, and we're all ready to go. Just tweak the dial a little bit, and we'll be all ready to go." And I've been saying for quite a while that I have real concerns, and it's not just
building workers, it's the professionals, it's the people in the local authorities, the people in the banks. It's at every level to make this function. There's a skills shortage, and the number of people and resources available. But you have to understand as well, the building industry have had a really awful 10 years too, and the nature of course, building contractors is provide the money and we'll make it happen for you. They're not people who are risk averse. They are people who get into, complex situations and make it happen, and they're practical and they get on with it. So it's understandable that after 10 years of very little that they would be saying, we'll work with you, provide the money and we'll make it happen. We'll find people to do it. I think what a lot of people didn't understand was that when we had in maybe 2004, 2005, 06, a huge uplift in the amount of houses being built, it coincided with Eastern Europe opening up, and we had a huge number of migrant workers that were skilled, trained in building, and a lot of them were willing to move because it was the first time they could leave their home countries. They could come here. They could a lot of them are still here and have made good lives for themselves. But there was this pool of skilled labour available at reasonable cost who all arrived and built houses. That's not going to happen again.
No, not when you consider Eastern Europe. The economies are actually they're standing on their own feet for the most part. They're relatively politically stable. There's economic prospects, and the cost of living here is.
But that's the catch-22. Yeah. You've got to house the builders to build houses, and if they can't afford to house people in Ireland, the construction workers, well, then how do you get them here to
But people also, naturally will try and find work closer to home if they can. So at the time, there were very few countries in Europe that did take people from Eastern Europe freely to come and work. Somebody now is more likely to probably go to Germany or the Netherlands than they are to come to Ireland.
Yeah.
At the time they couldn't. So the idea that people will travel longer distances doesn't really stack up. And if the cost of living here is really high and you can't find somewhere to live, that's another barrier to getting staff in here.
Well, I look at the employment status within the construction sector, and I have figured out, and you and I have spoken briefly about this, that the costs involved in building here are ramped up by what we would call irregular or less regular employment situations, and that direct employment gives you cheaper costs. So here, when the government say they can't build a house for 360, and yet you can bring in somebody else who can build them for half the price up the road from here, the difference is direct employment. And that goes into chain supply as well of materials, in that there isn't a whole load of people taking a cut along the way. And you were saying there's an issue about materials. When we go back to pyrite and we go back to other issues, that the standards of materials in this country, that there could be problems down the road here unless they get a grip of this.
Well, I don't think we've solved the problem when it comes to building materials. I mean, we have regulations in Europe about construction products, and that's based on the idea that you would have what's called market surveillance. So, people will have seen consumer programs from the BBC where trading standards go out and they have a secret camera and they catch somebody who's taking advantage of a person, or they're using shoddy materials,
cowboys,
or whatever substandard work. So that's what market surveillance really means, is that there's somebody actively out there checking. And you see it in the food industry and you see it in other places where there's a presence, or they will do swoops from the revenue or whatever else. We don't have any active market surveillance on construction products, which I think is a really weak link, and more or less the onus has been put back onto people on building sites and people certifying buildings to be reassured as to where materials have come from themselves. So there's a huge gap there, because you can't, even somebody who's actively on the site can't know if, and this has happened, say that glass has got a sticker that says this is fire rated glass, and it'll prevent fire spreading internally between two rooms in the building for an hour. Whether that's ordinary glass with a sticker or whether it's very expensive fire rated glass. So, that kind of fraudulent behaviour can happen. Substandard materials can be dumped here, imported into Europe, and it can be difficult to spot it. And then you have bulk materials like concrete and pyrite and gravel, that might have any kind of contaminants in it or might have the wrong mix. There's no way anybody can tell.
And that, like, I mean, from my professional experience, I remember when we used to order valuations on properties we were mortgaging, and we were always making sure, is it new build? Is it covered by home bond? And we remember the HB47 and the disaster that became, you know, and how we looked at this and we just said, well, it was a box ticking exercise. I'd take the HB47 box and I'd send it into a check issue and we'd be going from there. And then we found out very quickly that was purely a box ticking exercise and it wasn't worth not even the paper that it was printed on. And to see that we haven't addressed that and we haven't taken steps to actually close those loopholes where people can cut corners, it's very concerning. Like, what have we learned? Have we learned anything?
Well, I think, as you say, I mean, a lot of people found out that when they went to look for a policy or a warranty or whatever you want to call it, that it didn't cover an awful lot, and it was very limited in the policy. You know, sort of like having car insurance, but you have the accident and you discover it only covers, you know,
on Wednesdays. If you crashed on a Tuesday,
but if you think about why that happens, what happens is the insurance industry come and look at the risk, and they can only price the risk that they can quantify. That's how the insurance industry works. They need to say, what's the risk here? What could happen? What might we need to pay out on? And when they look at the construction industry here, and particularly the house building sector, never mind legacy problems, they see that there's a high risk. So what they're going to do then is they're going to say, okay, we'll cover A, B and C, but we won't cover D to Z.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's too uncertain. And, you know, people talk a lot about having mandatory defects policies so that when you buy your house, you get your policy and everybody has one and it covers everything. That's not going to happen in any way that's affordable until the insurance industry trust our building standards.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have a system of self-certification still. So the insurance industry don't trust the building standards because they don't know, is this somebody who has rigorously been on site with a very good builder and has taken a lot of care and has checked everything and knows where the gravel came from and has done that to a very high standard and at high cost? Or is it somebody who has paid somebody to sign a piece of paper who may not even be resident in this country? And because that's we have open borders in Europe. So, you know, the two pieces of paper look the same. And it's very hard to look behind that because the industry is allowed to check for itself.
Yeah, it's self-regulating.
Exactly, yeah. So I don't think we will have affordable insurance policies for home buyers and that level of consumer protection that they really need until we tackle that.
Yeah. On the big round, and it's very timely with Carillion, and what we've seen there is that the school buildings program is grinding to a halt. This ties into where we said about self-certification within the construction industry. There's subcontractors who haven't been paid, so they're not certifying until they get paid, and everything is held up. This public-private partnership model doesn't work.
Well, I have really grave issues with a lot of these large PPP, public-private partnership contracts, and just the principles behind how they work. Because what we really need now is policy that supports the small builders, the SME builders, the people who actually have the skills to build things and who know how to do it efficiently and to manage sites and to train apprentices. And, you know, they've had 10 tough years. They need to replace equipment. They need to buy plant and machinery. They need to train their staff. So the construction industry will only be sustainable if that layer is supported.
Well, to me, they're what I call the honest Joes. They're the builders who could build 20 houses, maybe 10 houses, small plots of land. These are the guys, and they use employees. Their biggest problem at the moment is they can't access the same finance as the guy who turns up with no staff, no plant and equipment, but gives the lowest bid.
But that's where policy comes in, I think.
Yes.
I mean, if you start from the principle that that is a really important part of the economy, supporting that layer who have skill and experience and have a quality objective.
Yes.
because that is what we can build on to have a construction industry here.
Well, they're the builders
And a
as
house
opposed
building
to
industry.
I mean, the guy who stands in front of a government department to put his bid in, that's an accountant. That's not a builder.
Yeah. But how would you support those organisations? So the way I see it is, if you have a housing site for 500 houses in public ownership, if you have 10 of those small builders notionally building 10 houses each of those has a public contract which they can take down to the bank to buy a new van on the back of. Each of those has income for the next year and certainty because they know where the money is coming from. Between them, there is competition. So the 10 will not want to have lower quality than the next group. They will be looking to do a good job so that they get another 50 from the local authority or a state agency in a year or two's time. The income and the certainty of that will allow them to do some private development or to buy a site and do something else as well. They will then be resourced if you set up the contracts correctly, that they have to employ people properly, that they have to take on apprentices and whatever. You can legally put social conditions into those public contracts.
And there is actually social conditions in the school buildings program. There is actually, but nobody pays a blind bit of difference to that.
But just to follow through the model of the 10 small builders doing 50 houses, you might think, well, that's going to be more expensive for the local authority. It's going to be more hassle. It's going to be more difficult. But it isn't actually, because that model lets you do a couple of other things. Firstly, instead of having a large site and saying we need to get one developer in for the large site and to do all the infrastructure and to get planning permission and to finance it and to find people to do it, you can start to break it out into manageable chunks. So while you are you master plan your site, while you are out tendering to these 10 small builders, the local authority directly can have somebody else putting in the roads and drainage.
Yes.
So they're de-risking it for the small builders. The small builders getting a smaller chunk. And you can save time because you're doing the roads and drainage
the infrastructure
while you're still designing and getting tenders for the smaller lots. When you get on site, then you will have competition between these guys for the subcontractors. So subcontractors then don't have to take poor conditions.
Yes.
Because if 8 of the builders are treating their staff properly, everybody will go and work for them.
Well, the bottom line is they'll cease to be subcontractors and will become employees, because
they will,
that's
but
the
even
way
if
to
they're
do it.
subcontractors, they'll be on better terms.
Yeah.
Because there's competition in the market between the 10. It also means the contracting authority or the people who are paying for it at the top can spot quality problems. Because if you have one of the 10 who's doing a bad job or doing it slowly or badly, they don't get a future contract. You start to weed out the people at the bottom,
Well, you'd never
and
have
you start to build up the people at the top. So you're building a much more sustainable
You'd
model.
never have that pyrite problem to the same extent again.
Well, the pyrite I think is a separate issue, but in terms of build quality, you can start to weed out the people who are.
You'd have a stand. You'd have a look.
Decent standard.
It's called. Look, if competition is going to work, it makes perfect sense what you say. You've 10 people looking across at each other, knowing that the next contract is contingent on being better than the man next to you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's as simple as that. And if I wanted to produce that, I need to produce a high quality finished product that is going to deliver at a reasonable return for me and good return for the county council or whatever has actually put the land out to tender. That makes perfect sense. What we're trying to do is, as you said, is put it out to a big conglomerate, and then we say at the end of that, we'll say, and will you give us this little parcel at the end of it through
Social and affordable housing.
No, yeah. What's the 50 section 51? Is it? Part 5. Yeah, a part 5. Yeah, let's have a little bit. Can we have that corner over there that you can give it back to us?
Which is often left until the end anyway.
Yeah, left to the very death, and then pay top dollar for it anyway.
Yeah. But to follow through on the 10 small builders, you're also saving the management structure at the top, which I suppose we can see from Carillion. You have a very big management structure at the top. The money does not flow down.
No.
When somebody controls the market, so if somebody is controlling a site for 500 units, they dictate terms.
Yes.
They say, this is all we'll pay you. They say, finish that by Friday, even if it's not done properly. As we see with the Carillion model in the UK, they weren't paying people for 3 or 4 months.
That's right.
So when somebody has a normal construction contract here, you're paid monthly. And if if you haven't finished something in time or you haven't built it properly, you don't get paid at the end of the month. There's a control system there. But the Carillion model was that they were funding it, but people were waiting 3-4 months to get paid.
And more importantly, sorry not to cut across you, but on the Carillion model, that was a legacy of the Blair Labour government in the UK. It took 20 years for that to come home to roost in terms of some of those deals that were signed, because they were hollowing out taking money off the top and hollowing out at the bottom by sucking the funds up into the conglomerate at the top. And when it eventually collapsed, they were left with huge billions of debt.
I mean, it was
UK.
essentially a pyramid scheme.
Hang on, Martin, but we're always behind the UK in these things.
Yeah.
And we're actually, we're only now waking up to the fact that we're 10 years into that, where they were 20 years into it, and we're 10 years into it, and we're looking and going, oh God, it ends in disaster over there. So we should be hitting the brakes now.
Yeah, well, I mean, the other side is if it looks like it's too good to be true, it probably is. I mean, if you can get free hospitals and free schools, and you pay for them over 25 years, you're going to pay an awful lot more over the 25 years. You're paying, you mightn't pay up front, but the long-term costs are enormous. I mean, in the UK on some of these deals, the national health system has gone and bought back hospitals because it was costing them so much on monthly payments. Now, there's proposal now for social housing to be built here on this model, again in very large contracts where there's no oversight. And you can see what's happened with the schools. Effectively, even though the state will be paying for them, they have very little opportunity to actually get involved at the moment. They just have to wait for this to play out. So in the meantime, we have the schools and the teachers and the parents left without the building. You have all the subcontractors who are probably the ones who bear the cost.
Well, I know anecdotally, because I've spoken to guys on the ground, they're not signing off till they get paid.
But that's another weakness in our system, because it's only the certifier at the top that has the cert that's needed. So it's only the one certificate at the top. All the certificates underneath are not statutory certificates, so they're not required by law. Yeah. They're only required if the person above them in the chain asks for them. So they have some control of holding back, because often these things were tied up with payments.
That's right.
But it's possible now that, again, even though we had a change in the law to protect subcontractors, that the subcontractors will come out badly on this.
Yeah, and I've done a lot in the area. I'm talking to people working on sites, and eyes and ears on the ground there. And I know anecdotally, and I know professionally from helping these guys, that there is no way that there is 100,000 self-employed construction workers in this country. There might be half of that are genuine subcontractors. The other half are nowhere near. So that's
back to your point about attracting labour into the construction industry. The construction industry is the gig economy by its nature.
Always was,
because if you're working as a tradesperson or an electrician or a roofer or whatever else, you will be on a site for a number of weeks, and then you'll be off doing something else with another contractor, and then you'll be back, and you'll be moving around. It's a bit stop-start. There's no continuity when times are lean. That's got worse and worse and worse. I heard of a case where from somebody recently where an apprentice was self-employed.
Yes. Yes, that's true. I know I've met that person.
So, that's how are you going to encourage any young person to see this as a career?
Yeah.
And how are you going to encourage people to upskill and to upskill their staff, and to ensure that we have better quality and that we have people available to do the work?
A lot of Irish guys have gone to Australia and they've avoided England altogether, because England is just as bad as here. We're just the same. But Australia has great conditions for the guys, the proper insurance, health insurance, stuff like that we'd never even think of here.
Well,
so that's where they're going.
Based on the UK model, prior to Carillion crashing, they were doing the social housing templates you were talking about, that we're talking about doing now. That's gonna it's gonna come this will be a big announcement by the Department of Housing that we're going to do this.
Well, they're already in negotiation. This been on for quite a while,
so they'll make this announcement. But in the UK, they were calling them Tesco towns, if you remember, flat pack towns, and of course the crash of Carillion now has said, oh shit, we shouldn't have went there. They've known that they've been exposing themselves to these Tesco towns, but no one has really speaking out about it because they're a few years down the line.
But see, the small builder model that I've been describing, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket.
Yes.
So, if 1 or 2 of the 10 contractors isn't performing, you can intervene because they won't get paid that month if they haven't done the work or whatever else. But more importantly, you can see there's an active involvement where there's a problem on the site or whatever else.
Yeah.
The problem with these big deals is you negotiate them once for 25 years. Yeah. One shot. And it's very hard to see what's going on. It's completely opaque. So you don't know that problems are happening until you're in a disaster management situation. And then the disaster management situation you can't even manage because you don't have the powers to get
There's no oversight. Yeah.
So construction traditionally had all of these checks and balances built in, the kind of traditional way construction worked, because the architects and engineers were on the client side. They were the eyes and ears of what was going on. They were in the middle. They were the ones who decided if the builder got paid every month. This PPP model, all of that expertise works for the builder.
Yes.
The client doesn't have anybody who's his eyes and ears on the job. The builder is directing these people. So even though you're paying ultimately for construction professionals and you're paying for all their advice, you can't access it. They work for the builder.
That's right. They all work for the builder. Yes.
So they know there's a problem on the site and they know there's quality problems and they know this hasn't happened in planning, whatever else. But they can't tell you. And you're the one paying for it.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, as a model for getting us out of, and we're in a huge hole at the moment where housing is considered, it's not going to work. And for the government we have at the moment, it's all about privatisation, profit taking. Needs to be a different model when it comes to affordable and social housing.
But the crux of that is probably we don't have unlimited amounts of money. We don't have unlimited amounts of money. I mean, I've seen some of the Part 5 you were talking about, which is the 10% social housing component. Some figures that have been submitted to local authorities for 400,000 or 500,000 for an apartment under Part 5.
It's crazy.
So, at the same time, local authorities can get a 3-bedroomed house built on a competitive tender out with a small builder for 200,000.
And built them up the road for 163,000.
Yeah, so is policy going to be to pay 400,000 for apartments that are built by the private sector and sold back to the local authority at very high prices? Or are you going to take that 400,000 and build 2 houses or 2 apartments?
Well, I think you know the answer to that. We've already gone down the former path. They are going to pay.
Well, I think the actual answer to that is neither. I think the actual answer to that is we're pushing even more on the co-living, communal living sort of most profitable type of property they can do now, where it's we can put these effectively glorified bed sits with shared. You don't need to. It's an apartment without facilities. We don't need to give you parking. It's glorified student accommodation, and it's the most profitable thing you can do at the moment if you're a builder.
It is for the first people to build them, but I think there's a finite market.
Yeah.
Actually, Dublin is not that big. If you're going to charge 1,000 a month to a young person working in the tech industry who comes from the continent, or a student who's in one of the universities or whatever else, and for 1,000 a month they have a very small bedroom and an ensuite shower room and use of a kitchen and a sort of social area downstairs. Yes. Within quite an easy bus distance, 4 of those students could get a house for 2,000 a month. So that's 500 each for a much better standard of living.
So you think
So I think the market, that high-end market, is quite limited. I mean, there are people who, obviously, if you were coming from Milan to work in one of the tech companies for 6 months, it would be really useful to go online and book somewhere that's comfortable and well built. Or if you're coming as a student from Japan, there's certainly a market there for it.
Not for the guy that was coming up from bloody Mullingar to pay €215 a week in Grange-Gorman. Like, they can't afford that.
Yeah, so what happens is people can't afford that, and a lot of people don't want that lifestyle. It's very transient type of buildings, and it's not very comfortable. You're on top of neighbours, and you've no control over who you live with. I mean, all the research into this co-living model, when you actually ask people what they actually want to live in smaller units with 4 or 6 people. They actually want to own the unit and to decide who they live with. They don't want to live with strangers in a permanent renting situation when the research has actually been done.
Well, you can't be 20 forever either. Yeah. You know, life moves on. You can't live in a single room in communal living and also progress as a human being. You can't. You need that space.
Well, like, I think it's forgotten sometimes that this is about people. And home means something. You know, home and community and the day-to-day stuff and your security, all of that means something.
Well, I think you've hit on it. Home is, and we describe it as home, regardless of whether it's negative equity, whatever other problems are. Before that, for the majority of people, it's home. So when, like we'll say with what was going on with the banks at the moment, when they're talking about kicking 15,000 people out of homes or 20,000 people out of homes.
Well, the number is actually, I think the number of people at risk is closer to 35,000. I remember when Mel sat there, he said in the best case scenario, if that washes true, you're looking at a trebling of current homelessness at the time, which was about 8,500. And everybody scoffed at David Hall, everybody scoffed at me, everybody scoffed, and now we're actually at the business end of it, where I saw Brendan Burgess jumping up and down yesterday saying, they need to repossess, and you're talking about, you know, hang on a second, I want to lay this out financially. The banks were provisioned for those losses when those loans started non-performing after 90 days, okay? Not after 5 years or 7 years as they're now non-performing. After 90 days, the banks made provisions. The banks had to that was money they had to set aside for non-performing loans. The state stepped in to fill the holes in the balance sheets and fill the holes in the balance sheets. The ECB printed bonds to the tune of billions and into a bond buying system where they gave money to flood into the banks. Now we're looking at a situation where the banks are saying, well, these are still non-performing loans, even though we've provisioned for them, we've paid for them, and we fill their balance sheet. We fill their boots with cheap ECB bonds, and then we want to sell these non-performing loans to vulture funds or whatever the equivalent is. Now, people say to you, that's the market. But what I'm saying to people, and I'm trying to get it out there where no one seems to get this, that this is the bank saying, we've had a cake, so we've eaten it. Now we want to take your cake and eat that as well, and we're not going to pay tax then on any of our profits. Now we return to profit. Can no one see the actual societal impact of this?
Well, I think that's, you know, the banks are entitled to act for their shareholders.
Yes.
In the same way that developers and landowners are entitled to act for theirs.
But if we're the shareholders,
but I suppose the difference is that the role of the policymakers in some ways is to be the adult in the room and to balance that. So. Of course, anybody who's in business has a right to do the best thing for their business. What the role of policymakers is to set conditions that mean there aren't social and political consequences, and to keep an eye on things. So, you know, if you go down the road of, you know, we will keep making housing smaller and maybe we don't even need windows because, you know, you de-risk it and it gets cheaper. Well, you know, somebody has to say this, stop.
Yeah.
Like this is a long-term investment for our country. Any housing we build in the next couple of years is a 100-year investment. We have housing that was built 100 years ago that is, really a good home and has been for since then. We have housing built 5 or 10 years ago that probably isn't going to last another 10 years, some of it. We have, as you say, the co-living model. We don't know, will they be reverted to hotels in 2 or 3 years' time because the market isn't there, or hostels,
or whatever.
You know, or will homeless individuals be put into shared accommodation like that with other homeless individuals? And will that be considered that they have been housed?
Yeah.
And is that a solution? And what are the social and political consequences of that? You know, of making silos effectively and saying, will you have a bed space? You know, your needs have been met. Well, as human beings, a bed space doesn't meet our needs.
It's like Mary McAuliffe. Mary
McAuliffe said
we warehouse our poor.
We convict the poor of poverty and we do it by warehousing them.
I mean, they are absolutely classic models for warehousing the poor. The classic models. You can have communal living, very low cost, high density. And I think what you said about adult in the room, that has really rung with me. There is no adult in the room on housing in Ireland. There's no adult in the room. We have a government that's so eager to be seen as everybody's friend in the construction industry that they're not saying, no, we're actually not here for you. We're here for people. We're not here to listen to what you want. I mean, the construction...
But you see, I don't think they have to be two different things, actually, because, you know, there are points in this where I've thought that even the people who are looking for something are looking for the wrong thing, you know, and they're not doing it for malevolence. They're doing it because they've misunderstood the problem, maybe, or because they're trying to revert to what they know. You know, there's been a lot of, I think, with the housing issue, trying to dial the clock back to about 2002.
Yes.
And if we just tweak everything to 2002, bingo, we'll have 3 years of.
Well, we are there right now.
We're not.
Well, when they're queuing outside looking for houses, if that's not ringing an alarm bell in Fine Gael or in government saying we're right back where we were, okay, it's there are some differences, but when you have people queuing for houses, that should ring alarm bells. That should say, okay, something's not going right here.
I think there's a bit of marketing going on as well. I mean, you know, there's a lot of media coverage
Oh, yeah.
for the queues,
We're
and
back.
the rain didn't help.
We're back with that. We're back with
Yeah.
property porn in terms of...
Every single newspaper on Sunday had property porn in it. Every single one of them.
But to go back to sometimes what people look for and the wrong people are looking for the wrong things, I think, in a lot of this. I mean, I think a lot of the conversation about this has been driven by people who don't understand housing or don't understand the human side of housing. And I think architects maybe bring that to the conversation, because architects are trained about how people use buildings.
That's right.
Not just about how to put the bricks together. You know, the culture of architecture is very much about how human beings interact with the space around them, and you know what that means. Some of this policy, I think, is driven by risk assessors in banks on spreadsheets. It's read by people reading spreadsheets. It's written by economists who are crunching the numbers without maybe knowing what's behind it and understanding the implications of things. I mean, one example of that is this idea of having fewer lifts in buildings.
Yeah.
This is one that, you know, logically you would think, yes, fewer lifts. A lift could cost 100,000 in an apartment block. If we take one out, the apartment block is 100,000 euro cheaper to build, and therefore all the flats will be cheaper. Well, that isn't the way things work. But they actually, by taking lifts out and having long corridor access, firstly have made poorer quality apartments. Long corridor access, and the research is all there, are very inhuman. It's very hard to know your neighbours. There's a lot of space in the building that nobody really owns that has to be cleaned and maintained, and someone's got to pay for the lights. And it's not very pleasant coming in and out, and corridors can be noisy. There's more issues with fire spread. You know, there's all sorts of other knock-on consequences to single aspect. Ventilation is poorer. People's mental health is poorer, because you might only get sun for an hour in the morning and you're in a shadow for the rest of the day. So there's all sorts of other issues around that. So you've saved 100,000, but the bigger issue in terms of financing the project is you have to now build the entire building. You have to build it in one phase, and you have to have finance for the whole building before you can occupy one apartment.
Yes.
When you had 3 or 4 apartments around each lift, you could build the building in slices. So like a Georgian Square in Dublin, you could build one slice and occupy it. You could build the next one. And the financing was much cheaper.
Yes.
For the builder, because he actually only had to pay for the first stair core and lift and 3 or 4 apartments per floor. He could occupy, sell them, put tenants in, finish it out, good sequence for the construction workers.
Yes.
And then he could be putting the foundations in on the one next door, which could have a party wall in
Nice
there.
continuum.
So actually, the having more lifts made not only better apartments, it made better fire safety, better ventilation,
sustainable living.
and cheaper to build, because the finance is a big component of the cost. And if you can reduce your finance costs down into phasing it, you're going to save more than the cost of not building the lifts. So that's the kind of an example of the sort of people who are driving policy, maybe, who don't have a holistic view of the complexity of building design, and have a maybe simplistic view about stacking boxes for people to live in.
Do we need some sort of group where we have the right people on the group deciding how housing goes forward in Ireland, instead of it always being a political hot potato? Do we need to take it out of the political arena?
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know, actually. I think it does need some leadership, and it needs a leadership that maybe has aligns in with other government policy about sustainability and things. Like we should, you know, I mentioned something else I was at recently when we had the snow. people had two problems. Some people had enormous heating bills.
Yeah.
Some people had their boilers break down for very simple reasons and they were cold. And a lot of people lost water supply.
Yeah.
And they couldn't flush their toilets and things. Now, there is no reason that all this new housing on a cost-neutral basis can't have virtually zero heating bills, so that they could have got through that spell without any additional cost and without the worry of a boiler breaking down and young children or elderly people in the house. And they could have had rainwater harvesting that would have meant they could keep flushing the toilets even if they were drinking bottled water.
We have amazing.
Now, there's no cost with doing that in the housing programme. And people would have more money in their pockets without the utility bills. But there isn't, I think, a drive to not just produce a policy or produce a regulation, but actually to get out there and make sure people know how to deliver it. Because it's back to that skills thing again.
Yes.
People have to know how to deliver it. And that's the professionals as well as the builders.
I mean, those guys who are now skilled in let's say, building the top standard houses, they are gone to countries where they want top standard housing built. Here, no, it's bricks and mortar, not interested.
Well, I think we tend to see high quality housing here as being the show house.
Yes.
Which is quite superficial.
Yes.
Because we're still building the kind of houses we built in the 70s and 80s with more insulation and a better another bathroom.
Yeah,
That's
and
really
a kitchen and a kitchen island.
It's the same house. It's just got more insulation. and
I've
extra
looked at a
bathrooms.
couple of the top-notch regulated or economic houses in Westmeath. There's a little group of them there, and then there's one out on their own, and they're nice houses. Now they're not to the scale of, they're smaller houses, but they are far more efficient houses. These people have virtually no bills. No bills.
Yeah, but if you get it right now, that will be, the money back into that local economy. If you build an estate where everybody is saving a couple of €100 a month on heating bills and more, that's money that's going back into other things in the economy.
Absolutely, it makes total sense. I've just come back from Spain, and every bloody rooftop I looked at has a solar panel on the roof. They're heating water and turning on lights, and they're paying, and they've got a surplus, and someone can pay it back into the grid. In local economies, you get together in local county councils.
But similarly with the rainwater, like we're not California. No. It rains out here. It's raining today. There is a plan to spend a lot of money building a pipe to bring water from the Shannon. Household need 30% of what you use in your house could be met by having a tank to catch rainwater that's used to flush toilets. The technology is all there for that.
There's an island. One of the little off the Bahamas around that coast, and everybody, the one charge they have every year is they have to keep the roof clean. And because they rainwater harvest, but everybody is water independent because they do it, and they have to clean their own roofs. It's the state charge you to clean your own roof once a year to keep it for your rainwater
harvesting.
harvesting.
Well, it's the small solutions, it's I've been talking about Dunkirk, where the big ships couldn't come, so all the little boats came.
Yes.
And the housing crisis and these kind of sustainability, it's all the little solutions that will be really effective because you can do them quickly. You can roll them out in a very gradual way. You can spend money as you have it rather than finding 20 million. You can roll it out slowly. And the same with vacant buildings. You can roll it out 20,000 here, 50,000 there.
I think
and get a momentum going on.
I think you've hit it there. We're at a Dunkirk moment with housing. We are, the people are on the beach. They are desperate for housing. And it's a great analogy. We're at that Dunkirk moment. The government has boats, big, huge tankers floating out there in the sea, but they can't make the connection to the people who are on the beach. It is the smaller things we need. It's the smaller ships coming in, taking 10, 15 people out at a time.
950 vacant units sitting that we can renovate. I think Mel estimated between 30 to 50,000 to make
Just
each
like
one
that.
of those.
Well, between the canals in Dublin, there's an estimate that there's capacity for 10,000 people in vacant commercial spaces. This isn't talking about the empty houses.
This is just above.
This is above shops and in vacant commercial buildings. And if you think about that, we're talking about people in silos before and having a small bedroom. A lot of the need for the people genuinely who want sustainable is not to put them there, it's to put them in an over-the-shop unit where they're in a community, where they have services, where they have privacy, and where they have a permanent tenancy. And, there's a long-term solution that is making somebody a home rather than just a bed space.
I mean, I've seen them in England, in London, where people live over shops. It's actually great. My friend had a great apartment over a shop. It is. You're smack bang in the community. If you need schools, whatever service you need, they're on your doorstep.
But it also means the carers who are visiting elderly people can do it in a more sustainable way. They can visit 10 people instead of driving to 3. There's lots of other benefits to doing that. You're taking car transport off the road. You're supporting local shops because it's footfall. There's all sorts of other benefits to it.
Well, I have to say thank you very much for coming in. This has been very enlightening. And I think the one thing I'm going to take away, we are at that Dunkirk moment. And the big ships may be out in the sea, but we need the small ships to come in and get people onto the big ships. And we need it really badly.
And I tell you what, the nicest analogy you used, well, not analogy, the nicest way you put it was about using the word home instead of a housing need. We start talking about homes, what it means to people, and how, speaking as an architect, you're saying about what it means to people. Because that doesn't come across when we talk about numbers, because I'm terrible for talking about numbers as I blurt them out, and that's been wired into me. But, when I often said when I was selling mortgages, people came in and they were sitting there and they were looking at the application form. All they really cared about was the 4 walls and the roof. And, you're actually just giving them, I used the terrible phrase of debt servitude, right? You were tying them into this, but they wanted a home. If we were to put people in a holistic point of view and look at it in that space, there are simple solutions. There are workable things. 10,000 people that can be housed above units. We can, if you want to go and appeal to your free market people, you can tell people in Airbnb, if you want to use it as Airbnb, use the above the shops, and we give you a little tax break on that, and that'll free up 10,000 apartments that are currently, and we can go. There's so many little tricks that we're missing here. And I actually think you're really onto something in terms of making sure that all of the new houses that we're going to build are sustainable, energy independent and water independent. It's just makes sense. Especially, I saw a statistic that we had 3 days worth of snow and we'd water shortages, and California had 7 years of drought and they didn't once turn the water down. Get a grip. We live in one of the wettest places on earth. It just doesn't make sense. Thanks so much, Orla.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking.
Thank you. It's really lovely.
Guys, just want to thank you all for listening. Remember, please hit subscribe, leave us a review, and tell your friends. You can support us for as little as €3 a month on echochamberpod.com, and you can get all our previous episodes on the website. You can send us an email to theechochamberpod@gmail.com. Thank you.